All right, and we got on Rumble. It says ZOMG. This is awesome. Me LOL says $20. Rumble also don't care about the Nirvana kid. Okay, let's get to the stuff that I know people are going to care about. Biden losing yet again in court. I guess we'll start with the CDC eviction moratorium. Okay, Robert. So we covered it many times. You called it. People say it was an easy call, but it doesn't matter. You make the easy calls. You make the hard calls. You make the calls that people don't even know are coming. The Supreme Court came down 6-3. It was the three dissenting were Breyers,
the three Democratic appointees.
I want to get
Breyers, Sotomayor, and Kagan.
Okay.
Even Roberts flipped his opinion because he initially didn't join the. It was 4 justices initially that said this is obviously illegal, not authorized by statute. Kavanaugh salvaged it by saying yes, it's illegal, but hey, it's almost about to expire, so let's wait. But Roberts didn't join them. Now, because of the outrage, because of how it made the court look like it was inept and incompetent and a joke, Roberts flipped sides and joined him. So that only the 3 liberals were left dissenting, and 6-3 said, no, clearly Congress never gave this authority. Congress will have to try to give them this authority. Maybe they have it. Maybe Congress has the authority. Maybe they don't. I don't believe under the Interstate Commerce Clause they have the authority to regulate intrastate landlord-tenant relationships myself. But I don't think they have the constitutional authority. But it'd be like part of the way Roberts salvaged the case is by limiting the analysis to a statutory analysis without doing a constitutional analysis because it was sufficient to do the statutory analysis. That's also probably why he joined the case, because an internal rule in the Supreme Court is the Chief Justice, if he's part of the majority, he assigns whoever it is going to write the decision, or he is the final author on the decision. So that's Roberts does this all the time, where he'll deliberately join a particular side he doesn't even agree with, so he can control what is said in the decision itself. But it was a foreclosed, in my view, always. But the D.C. Circuit said just the opposite. They said, "Oh, clearly this will be upheld," and clearly, of course, it was not.
It is. I'm more interested in the dissent than I am in the majority decision, because the majority decision is just obvious. They say the CDC does not have this authority. You are depriving people of private property. You're basically nationalizing rental ownership to the state. That none of it made any sense whatsoever. It couldn't be justified under any criteria of law if Congress wanted to do it. Instead of sitting on the steps of Congress complaining, they should have been in Congress trying to pass a law. And if it doesn't pass, that's where it ends. So, I mean, that was the majority decision. It's constitutional law 101. I'm just fascinated by the dissent, because I thought the dissent at one point was purely procedural, in that they say, well, we're dissenting because we don't want to make a decision now. We want to hear the full briefing on the file, although I don't even know what that would look like. But they went one step further and said that this could be justified because the balance of the inconvenience, or the balance of the convenience, the balance of the risk or harm, weighs in favor of the people who are getting kicked out of their apartments and not in favor of the landlords who are just losing a little bit of money. I mean, if you can steelman the dissent, how do you steelman the dissent?
Well, you ignore the statutory issues, you ignore the constitutional issues, and you just disguise your political biases as an equity balancing injunctive analysis. So you say, well, we're only here to decide whether a preliminary injunction should issue. That requires we look at the balance of the equities, and we say that the balance of the equities are imbalanced in favor of not giving the injunction based on our political beliefs that we'll disguise as factual realities. And now that happens all the time. Courts do this frequently. Now, their argument is that the problem is connecting it to the CDC's rationale, because it's one thing to say, you know what, we don't want a lot of people evicted. That's one thing. That eviction is more consequential than money. That you could make that claim. But it's another thing to say that's the role of the CDC. What they would have to say is this eviction will cause a massive spike in COVID. And you had people like Breyer using charts, because this is what more and more judges do. They go to the internet and look up what they want to look up, and they found charts that were outdated. So Breyer cited the chart saying, look at this surge. And one, I was like, okay, that has nothing to do with evictions. You're showing no correlation. Two, he failed to include all the data that showed the surge going the other way. So, I mean, it showed, and he obviously didn't even know that the chart he was showing was based on PCR testing, which has its own controversy in terms of accuracy and efficacy. So but yeah, the argument would be that the CDC is right factually that this will lead to a massive spike in COVID, which they've never fully said. They just said maybe, and it could. And you say that emergency health concern means that we shouldn't get involved on an injunctive basis right now. And well, let's wait to do the statutory and constitutional argument later. They're mostly saying that because the fact that the dissent did not go to great lengths to say this was statutorily authorized or constitutionally unquestionable tells you that even the dissent knows that this is not something that's authorized by law. This is not something that's likely approvable. They're just saying it sounds like a good policy, so let's pretend otherwise. And for those people that might critique me politically or critique us politically, I said the same thing when Trump did it. I said this is politically smart and unconstitutional and illegal. Trump, the same logic that Trump had is what the three liberals had. Hey, this might be a popular policy, so let's keep it around.
But someone's saying, is this not eminent domain, Brad Thorne, and why is no one talking about it? So I just Googled it. Eminent domain is taking, but explain what eminent domain is.
So this is in my view, it's a regulatory taking, what they call regulatory taking, which is by regulation when the government does an action that effectively prevents you from effectively using your property. It's still a debate. I mean, true eminent domain, they actually take your property. This is not conventional eminent domain. This is, in my view, regulatory taking because the language eminent domain isn't in the Fifth Amendment. It's if the government takes your property, they have to give you just compensation, period. And this is clearly taking property, in my view. And it's taking a core right of the property, which is to be able to rent it or not rent it to whom you want. But it's unlikely that the courts are going to acknowledge this as a regulatory taking. So it is likely that the landlords will never be compensated for their loss.
And I mean, yeah, I was just questioning what the dissenting said we should wait for a full briefing on the file. What does a full briefing look like? Because it seems to me there's not really much. I don't know what is left.
There isn't anymore. They're just saying, hey, we think this is a good policy. It's probably bad law, but let's wait a little longer. That's all they're really. That's what waiting for a full briefing is. It's wait a little longer because we think the politics are good, even if the law is bad. And if they were smart, they would have proposed a compromise and said, we'll acknowledge this as a regulatory taking. That way, all the landlords will be compensated by the government at the end of this in exchange for continuing and allowing the eviction moratorium to continue. They weren't willing to do that because they don't want to give it a regulatory taking either. They want the government to take property without having to pay you for it.
Yep. And why couldn't Congress have gotten this passed if indeed it was something that they think they had the support to do? How long does it take to get this passed by Congress if they wanted to?
Oh, it was up in August, and they just couldn't get support for it. I mean, that was their problem. There weren't enough votes for it because they know that it's not that popular. It's popular, but not so overwhelmingly popular as to be sustainable over time. Especially not without compensation. Again, this would be different if they told the landlords, we'll pay the rent instead. They're not doing that.
I read somewhere that some of the landlords were getting 80% of property value or fair market value, but not 100%. It wasn't zero, so they, in theory...
But also depends on the landlords. Big landlords are getting paid. Smaller landlords are not. So there's a big gap between who they are, as a general rule.
And someone in the chat said this is a great way to wipe out the small landlords and allow for the mass acquiring of residential units by, I don't know, hedge funds.
Well, it's already happening. I mean, the hedge funds are the number one buyer driving up prices in homes is not consumers. It's hedge funds. They're buying up properties and they plan on renting them out. It's not like they're going to live in all of them.
I believe the name was BlackRock. And what I did notice going door to door, by the way, even in my own area, I noticed a lot of places were being rented by people who were not from, based on the fact they said they were not eligible voters, people not from around here. And it's very interesting to see houses in my particular neighborhood. As you get higher up in Westmount, the houses get bigger and more expensive. To see people who are not residents renting out those places, and the residents whom I've known for my whole life, not living there anymore. It's a very interesting dynamic as to what we see going on with home ownership. All right, so that's a done deal. I mean, actually, practically speaking, now what happens to the landlords? They get to evict, and they're going to get screwed. They haven't gotten paid.
Yeah, they get to start evicting, but it depends on where they're at, because there's some city governments and state governments that have their own eviction moratoriums in place.
Well, and I was thinking, comparing it to Quebec law. Quebec law, you don't just get to evict a tenant; you have to take him to we call it the Régie du Logement, which is like the I don't know, the rental board.
All that has to be done here.
Okay,
usually 2 weeks. You have to go through a judicial process. You can't do self-help. None of that.
Oh, in Quebec, it's one step worse. Is that the tenant can wait until they get a judgment, and they can pay everything they owe, even after, right up until judgment, and not get evicted. So
that's true in many parts of the states.
It's an absolute.
They're not going to. Some of these people owe a year's rent. Their whole thing was living there free while they're buying a boat. They'll just be looking for a new place. That's all.
That's it. They're gonna abscond. The landlord is going to be left holding a nice empty bag filled with a little bit of shit, and it's going to be wonderful.